At 2:44 a.m. on June 17, 2025, the night sky over Tel Aviv shattered with the shrill cry of air raid sirens. What moments earlier was a quiet, sleeping city turned into a storm of fear and urgency. Two ballistic missiles, believed to be Birken-class variants, had been launched from Houthi-controlled Yemen, traveling nearly 1,700 kilometers toward Israeli territory. One missile was aimed near Jaffa, the other streaked dangerously close to Ben Gurion International Airport. Windows trembled. Families scrambled to shelters. The city held its breath. This wasn't a drill or a test. It was deliberate, a long-range strike, precise and calculated, designed to send a clear political and military message. The Iran-backed Houthi rebels had chosen their moment carefully. On paper, they were under a ceasefire, but not with Israel. The truce, signed on May 6, 2025, was between the Houthis and the United States, an agreement intended to halt all Houthi attacks on American naval and commercial vessels in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Israel, however, had never been part of that deal. By firing on Israeli territory, the Houthis weren't technically violating the ceasefire. But they were testing its boundaries, and Washington's patience. High above the region, USAWACS surveillance aircraft and ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, drones were already patrolling the skies. Below them, American F-15s, F-16s, and F/A-18 Super Hornets were fully armed and waiting. They did not fire, because US forces were not directly targeted. But the Houthis had done something far more provocative. They had launched missiles within range of US assets and toward one of America's closest allies. In military terms, that's not an act of restraint. That's a dare. At dawn, US and Allied command centers across the Middle East exploded into activity. Technically, the Houthis hadn't broken their deal with Washington. But strategically, they had crossed a red line that no ceasefire could hide. Since the agreement in May, intelligence reports had already tracked several smaller-scale Houthi missile launches aimed at Israel. Most were intercepted or went unnoticed by the global media. But this one was different, longer range, better coordinated, and deliberately timed. Analysts noted that the missiles followed precise trajectories, suggesting careful pre-launch testing and Iranian technical support. The Houthis were making a statement. They could strike deep into Israeli territory, even under a ceasefire. The US faced a dilemma. If it ignored the attack, it risked looking weak and unreliable to its allies. But if it responded militarily, it could reignite a regional war stretching from Yemen to Iran. Across the Red Sea, the decks of US aircraft carriers were alive with quiet readiness. Fighter jets were fueled, armed, and on standby. American forces in Qatar, the UAE, and Djibouti updated their readiness protocols. Orders were clear: maintain defensive posture, prepare for rapid response, and monitor every inch of Yemeni launch territory. It wasn't officially declared a no-fly zone, but the message was unmistakable: the skies were now under watch. Missiles were live. AMRAAMs, Sidewinders, and precision-guided bombs sat locked on rails. Every pilot understood the weight of the silence above them. ISR drones fed a continuous live tactical map, stretching from western Yemen to the heart of Israel, into command rooms in both Tel Aviv and US regional headquarters. That shared data meant that if the situation escalated, American and Israeli forces could operate in near-perfect sync within minutes. A senior defense official summarized it bluntly: "We didn't fire, but if this continues, we will." The ceasefire had a loophole, and the Houthis exploited it masterfully. The agreement with the United States didn't mention Israel. Legally, they hadn't violated any clause, but geopolitically, they had poured gasoline on a smoldering fire. When a US ally is hit with ballistic missiles and American fighters are already in the air, that's not a misunderstanding, that's provocation. And provocation without precision is always a gamble. The Houthis were betting that Washington wouldn't retaliate, calculating that the US would avoid escalation to preserve the fragile ceasefire. But their calculation didn't account for perception. In military strategy, silence after aggression can sound a lot like surrender. By mid-morning, Israel had already made its move. Fighter jets screamed southward toward Yemen, striking radar installations, launch sites, and command nodes deep inside Houthi-controlled territory. These were not symbolic retaliations, they were surgical, designed to cripple the infrastructure that made the launch possible. Fuel depots, missile assembly hangars, communication nodes. Every strike carried a message of deterrence. Meanwhile, US forces held their positions, officially neutral, but in practice, deeply entangled. American ISR aircraft were sharing live targeting data with Israel in real time. US jets maintained overwatch across the Red Sea, ready to engage if the conflict spilled outward. The line between observer and participant was blurring by the hour. Inside US command centers, urgent questions filled the air. What if another missile was launched? What if it veered off course toward an American asset? What if an Israeli strike hit too close to US forces by mistake? And most importantly, how much longer could Washington afford to stay silent? Because this is how wars begin, not with declarations, but with ambiguity. Every regional actor was watching closely. Iran, Hezbollah, and even Russia monitored the US response. A weak reaction could embolden Tehran to escalate elsewhere, perhaps through its proxies in Lebanon or Iraq. For American strategists, the stakes were clear. If the Houthis could fire long-range ballistic missiles across 1,700 kilometers under a ceasefire and face no direct consequence, it would send a dangerous signal, not only to the Middle East, but to every nation watching US deterrence in action. By the afternoon, Israeli airstrikes had subdued several key targets, but the region remained on edge. Every radar blip, every launch signature was being tracked. The US military had not fired a single shot, but the readiness level across the region was higher than it had been in years. Major Alex Green, a US Navy Super Hornet pilot, was among those airborne that morning. He had flown dozens of sorties over the Red Sea before, but this mission felt different. His cockpit display glowed with data, live missile arcs, trajectories, impact estimates. He watched as the Israeli Iron Dome intercepted one of the incoming projectiles, its counter-missiles lighting up the pre-dawn sky. Yet no order to engage came through. Green and his wingmen held position, tracking, calculating, waiting. Later, he described it simply: people think the hardest part of being a fighter pilot is pulling the trigger. But sometimes, it's not pulling it. That's what stays with you. When his jet finally returned to the carrier deck that evening, the air was thick with tension. The Houthis had tested the edge. They weren't finished. The next launch might not be a warning, it might be a hit. And next time, the response might not be measured. Every pilot, every strategist, every commander now faced the same haunting question: what happens when the next missile leaves no room to wait? Was June 17th just a one-time gamble by the Houthis, or the opening move in a new air conflict that could drag the entire Middle East back into the flames?